Doom 3 is a first-person survival horror game that follows an unnamed Marine who arrives on the Mars City base, but after witnessing a demonic outbreak, he's left alone to bring an end to Hell's demons. Atmosphere. Doom 3 mostly takes place in the cold metallic corridors of Mars City, with the now iconic ID Tech 4 lighting making the environments deeply moody and atmospheric. There's a feeling of claustrophobia from the narrow corridors, and there's always a sense of apprehension when delving into the pitch black rooms. In the original version of the game, the flashlight was considered its own weapon and required the player to choose between seeing where they were going or defending themselves from what lurked in the darkness. Sadly, in the BFG Edition, you can activate your flashlight whenever, even with other weapons equipped. And after playing the original version of the expansion pack, Resurrection of Evil, I can see why this would be a popular change, but keeping the two things separate did add a lot of the dread to exploring darkened areas. Besides the mild apprehension, the atmosphere doesn't get many opportunities to shine because of the combat, which is obviously a large chunk of the game. The section where you teleport into Hell was one of my favourite depictions of Hell in a game, and really does a great job of harnessing the spiteful atmosphere such a place would bring. But sadly, it's over too quickly. Really, it's the lighting and dark, confusing and seemingly endless corridors that reinforce a feeling of isolation and apprehension for what the game delivers next. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares aren't especially unique, and for Doom 3's considerable length, they repeat a lot, with most of them being Doom staples like monster closets that open up and unleash enemies to attack the player, or they just spawn enemies in behind them. The combat itself would only really be as stressful as you find the game difficult. That being said, most of the enemies seem to take a lot to put down, but personally I found most of the combat fun as opposed to stressful. Besides the combat, there's jump scares with enemies waiting to jump at you from behind doors or making a loud noise as you go past them. These are mostly hit and miss. However, I found that even though the game used the monster behind the door trick multiple times, it managed to startle me more often than I expected. I think in the middle of combat though, it's easy to ignore the jump scares as you're already fighting other things. There are some scripted events, and I found some of them pretty cheesy, with the screen going red and something weird happening like the Marine's face rapidly aging in a mirror or something along those lines. These aren't impactful and often just led me to shrug it off and continue gunning things down. I think the combat itself and the nature of first-person shooters is going to dramatically reduce the number of possible ways to scare a player when they're already in a state where they're trying to kill everything around them. You can't be a badass space marine and also frightened by the creatures you're mercilessly slaughtering, but maybe a higher difficulty level than normal is required. Sadly, Doom 3 doesn't really have any other tricks up its sleeve, and what is there is kind of lost in the combat. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The game's music really only consists of the title music and some brief stings and incidental music, and while some of these really would have helped make the atmosphere in some sections more prevalent, they're mostly over before they've started. Other than this, there's a frankly amazing selection of sound effects for so many machines and environmental objects that it really makes the Mars City base come alive. From steam hissing to the sound of lasers and groaning metal structures, there's often so many different effects playing at one time that is extremely impressive, but sadly a lot of it is drowned out by the sound of gunfire and monsters roaring. In the quieter sections you can pick out things like hearts beating and a mysterious droning noise coming from seemingly nowhere. It's often totally unnecessary, but really nice nonetheless. The guns I find a bit weak sounding, and there's no sound for bullet impact, which would have been nice considering the way the Gore is portrayed.
Do I need to remind you of the groundbreaking work that we're doing here?
No, but I've been authorized by the board to look at everything.
The board authorized you? The board doesn't know the first thing about science. All they want is something to make them more money, some product. Don't worry, they'll get their product.
The voice acting for most of the characters is good enough, with the exception of Betruger, who steals the show with his hammy acting. It's often really fun just to have someone so blatantly evil among the other bland characters. Outside of the cutscenes, voices get lost in the mix as everything seems to be panned to the center channel, and gunfire ends up drowning it out.
BFG's current leading research facility, Delta Labs, where Union Aerospace is opening all new opportunities in research and development. With continued investment and hard work, the Union Aerospace Corporation strives for excellence and is committed to building a better tomorrow.
The sound space is full of effects, but some of the panning and reverb felt a bit flat, with most of the environments having quite stunted reverb despite everything being made out of solid metal. It's not a deal breaker, but it would have been nice to have. Regardless, the sound design is pretty impressive for the game's age, and it never really breaks immersion. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. Doom 3's blood is dark red and smears over the clean and sterile surfaces of Mars City nicely. There's a real art form to how some of the blood elegantly travels along the corridors like it was done with a paintbrush. However, the gore effects haven't aged particularly well, and some of them are a bit generic, with weapons like the chainsaw just making a red cloud and killing the enemy, as opposed to anything more detailed. But on the other hand, shooting zombies with something like the shotgun blasts them to pieces, revealing their skeleton, and sometimes you can even catch their brain falling to the ground. It's not shocking, it's usually just kind of cool in a cheesy way. Some of the bodies have the skin ripped off of their faces, and whilst this sounds horrifying, the graphical style sort of lets it down, and it's repeated quite a bit, so it wears off after a while anyway. There are some really demonic style things on display in certain areas of the game, and the intent here often shines through the limited graphics, alongside some of the giant organic tentacles seen going through the base in certain parts, which are slick and sort of gross looking. The gore is a mixed bag between the serious and the silly, and while some things could be better, a lot of what's here is enjoyable despite the conflicting tones. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. Arriving on Mars City as the unnamed Marine, you're tasked with investigating something in a distant part of the base, when you meet a scientist who's trying to warn people about experiments going on there. At the same time, Councillor Swan arrives to talk to Dr. Betruger, with the intent of finding out why there have been so many accidents at Mars City. Betruger resists, demons swarm Mars City, killing nearly everyone, and Betruger takes on the form of antagonist, summoning demons to kill the Marine before he can stop Betruger. The story is mostly told through cutscenes that take place throughout the game. However, it's easy to forget what's going on, since it's often very long time before you get to see what's happening next, and the plot development seems to straight up stop around the final third of the game, where the goal is just to stop Betruger. There's a lot of what feels like padding, with many of the lab sections going on for far too long with no story development during that time. There are diary entries and video discs, but there's an overwhelming number of them, and while some of them were interesting, a lot of them just parroted the same things of things going wrong and systems failing long before the demonic outbreak, or they were just totally irrelevant to what was going on. Besides the fact that they pulled a break on the gameplay, a lot of them just weren't really fun to read. The story clearly isn't designed to be the main focus of the game, and it often feels as though the story is going on separately to the gameplay, and the two rarely end up meeting. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. For me, Doom 3 is a first-person shooter first and foremost, and a horror game a distant second, and most aspects of the game reflect this, from the obvious emphasis of combat to the many things designed to be fun as opposed to frightening. It's definitely not a bad game, but it doesn't come to mind when I think of horror games. Next time I'll be working on the second to last part of the Harry Mason scale videos about stories and horror games. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to support the channel on Patreon, feel free to pop over. If you don't and want to see what I'm up to, there's a weekly update on Patreon as well as projected schedule for what's coming up. And if you just want random junk, there's a Twitter that I almost sort of update. Links are in the description. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I sent the demons back to where they came from, I did not scream like a banshee or run over the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.